is free will really free, or is it an illusion?
Ah, I'm just checking the time because the answer to this will take probably more than the hour allocated. It's a very good question. Swami Vivekananda himself deals with this question. He points out that the two things, freedom and will, cannot really go together. They are antagonistic phrases. Why would that be so? Is because will estimates a precondition has to be there. Some material has to be there. If I will to move a table, then pre-existing table must be there. And he mentions that Schopenhauer, the great philosopher, who used Vedanta and Buddhism in his philosophy, put as the highest absolute source, the highest creative source as that entity that's exercising its will. And Swami Vivekananda takes issue with this position and says that in his opinion, this is wrong. Because of this pre-existing entity that is necessary in order to exercise a will over. And I think a more accurate understanding of this question of free will is more free choice. The best and simplest explanation for free will or apparent free will is really Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna creates a story. He says it's like a calf being tethered to a post. So you can imagine now that there is a calf or any other animal tied to a post. And given a long range, so it can roam about an entire field and graze as it wants. But of course, it thinks it has freedom, but it doesn't. It's always tethered to this post. So I don't think we had free will in being able to fly or not being able to fly. Many people would like to fly, and they can do it. They can short circuit the long process of evolutionary time, and with man's brain invent an airplane and fly in this way. So I often joke, when somebody says to me, "Are you flying?" I said, "No, I rather take an airplane. It's very hard on the arms." So the thing is, we don't have much choice in it. We have a limited choice in our environment. And there's every reason why the universe presents itself as it presents itself, because it gives us these limited options. We have a limited framework. There are limited laws to the universe. And some of these laws we may have evolved along with the universe. There's a great debate about that. So let's look at it in a different way. The question really is asking, are we living in a deterministic world or one which we determine? Is there determinism or indeterminism? So in all these complex questions, there is no quick and easy answer, because it's a mixture of both. We have to take into account another factor, which is called the relativity of perception. Things look as they are from a certain point of view. And there may be, for every 20 shifts of view, there may be 20 different points of view, 20 different approaches. We have to learn to have the facile ability to jump from one thing to another. And philosophy gives us the capacity to do this. You can think of the Vedanta philosophy as a wonderful toolbox, A to Z. If your car breaks down, I may have said before, you don't have to go through the whole range, A to Z. You can simply select the correct tool for the appropriate moment. The car breaks down, fine. You take the toolbox out. Next thing, you examine what specifically went wrong. What is the bolt that needs fixing? And you take out the appropriate tool for that. You don't use any other tool. Now, in mechanical engineering, there is something called a multi-purpose tool. Actually, in Africa, we have a funny saying. We call it a Babijan spanner. I don't know what the connection is, but a Babijan is a baboon, actually. So it's I have no idea why that connection is there, but it means that something that you just change its opening, and you can deal with a small bolt, you can increase it, you deal with a very large one. So you have that range. And in terms of then Vedanta, the non-dualistic position is the ultimate tool. It solves all the problems. So if you take this question from the non-dualistic point of view, where there is only one entity, you see how we emphasize, we don't say monism, we say non-dualism. Many people prefer to say monism. But what's the advantage of saying non-dualism is to say monism means one. Non-dualism says not even one. So we have to take that extreme point of view and say not even one is there. Or if you like the convenience language, one without a second. So no second is there. That clarifies the position then. So from this position, there is no determinism from the absolute point of view. But from the manifest point of view, there is a sequence which is a causal law. And that causal law carries over to the psychological realm, to the spiritual endeavor realm, where everything that is sown has its effect. Every sowing has a reaping. Every cause has an effect. And the Sankhya philosophy, which is adopted by everybody pretty much in terms of the relative world, will tell us that the cause and effect are the same thing. It's a bit like an ocean where waves come up, and the wave comes up in a peak, and the cause of the peak was a preceding hollow, and the cause of the next hollow will be the peak, and so it goes on. But only one ocean sits behind it. So it's a very, very good analogy of the ocean and the manifested area. In the manifested world, it is, as Sri Ramakrishna pointed out, it seems to be that we have great freedom, but actually there are restrictions. And so the world, in terms of restrictions, is deterministic. The world, in terms of apparent freedom, this is indeterministic. So we have some free will. Now let's stick to that example of the animal that is tied to a post and doesn't know that it's tethered. The illusion of free will that it has enables it to make some choices. And the choices are between two or more things. If there's only one thing, of course, we don't need to have any choice. There are no alternatives. And so this is put in practical spiritual life as prayers and shreyas. This is the preferable path, the path that we can go on. And then the other side of it is the one that will give us ultimately pain. And one looks like the other. Spiritual life looks dull and disinteresting when you begin, until discrimination endorses your endeavor and you realize, oh, what is preferable against what is pleasurable is a more lasting, more enduring thing, and will have a lasting effect in the end and will give enormous bliss. The other path will give a temporary pleasure, some blip. And the temporary pleasure will be the hollow in the causal relationship, the pain. So there's a cycle. Every pleasure is followed by a pain. Every pain comes up with a pleasure again because of this causation law. And the causation law is driven and sustained by our misunderstanding that there is no totality of anything. There is no ocean in the example. And so when there is a hollow, a depression in our mood, when there's a depression in our behavior, when our response becomes negative because the world is impinging seemingly on us and we're looking for some kind of reaction, then we dive into our memory and we come up with a faulty formula. desiring that there be no hollow, we attempt to produce a peak. But the peak is not sustained. That's the problem. And it is always followed by the depression again. And so it goes. At some point, one hollow or painful moment is more impinging on us than anything else. And at that point, we may decide through free will or seeming free will that we will make a different choice in our direction. That we will then take stock and say, this is not getting anywhere. There's a cycle going on. And this cyclical arrangement is not giving what I'm seeking. So everybody, as I mentioned previously, is seeking happiness, enduring happiness. Of all the impulses of man, we want enduring happiness. And at some point, we believe that we may get it, even in a profound way, through prayer. Lord, give me this happiness. Lord, give me a better life and give me an enduring afterlife. And seeing that this formula is derived from +1 and -1. I give me this, followed by brackets, I don't have it. +1, -1. I would like this, I haven't got it. I want happiness, I haven't got it. I want pleasure, I haven't got it. And so what we call greed is really a dissatisfaction with getting what we want and then feel that we have to repeat it. And at some point we realize, even in prayer, that +1, -1 is not going to work. A different formula has to be derived, something that is deeper, something that is more general. And when we look more at the totality, we find that there is nothing to gain or to lose, because what we require is already here. It's not something to access. There is no point in time where there's any linear progression. We have to start thinking of things in terms of cycles. There is a useful passage in connection with this, and I should introduce, for those who haven't studied it, Swami Vivekananda's wonderful series of talks compiled into this book, Raja Yoga. For me, this book is a foundation book. For me, historically, the foundation is because at the age of 15, for myself, I was in something of a revaluation mode. Life forced on me a circumstance whereby I had to look at things very differently. And I was brought up in a certain tradition, and I thought, I haven't explored any of the other traditions. Let me see if there's something in all the other religious traditions. So I started investigating Islam, various aspects of Christianity. By the time it came to Hinduism, then I met my first teacher, my first philosophy teacher. When we talk about teachers, we have to take into cognizance the fact that your first teacher or your first teachers are your father and mother. They are the ones who brought you into biological life. And for good or ill, they are the ones who are teaching you. Most children learn by example. And so whether they taught you anything systematically or not is besides the point. All your impressions that come in what we call transactional analysis from your parents' script, all of them are introduced from your parents' sayings, your parents' behaviors, and what they allow and what they disallow. So today, part of the parent script is television. Children are made to sit in front of the television, made because, you see, it's the most convenient thing. If the children are bored or children don't have any occupation, or if they're making a lot of noise, you pacify them, you sit them in front of a screen, and they look in amazement. I often think that if there was an alien species that came down invisibly to assess what humans do, they'll go back and report. For endless hours, they sit in front of a small box, and that box produces pictures. It's a kind of window, I suppose. We don't exactly know how it works, but humans seem to be extremely attached to this and attracted to this, looking at it for hours and hours on end. And funny part about it is, whatever comes up on the screen is exactly what they experience, maybe in a more dramatized way, than all their daily life. They go away and they work, and they look at the television and they see it's all about work. They go and they encounter some opinions and they see it on news broadcasts on that box. And then in their own life, they have huge dramas, domestic arguments, and they see it again on this box, this magic box. What a funny thing. So Swami Vivekananda brings this book together, Raja Yoga, and I bring up my own experience because it was the first book that I really studied to get to grips with some different way of thinking in this world. And it's relevant in this day and age as it was when Swami Vivekananda paced up and down and when a stenographer took the notes that they took, because it is the science of religion. It is the explanatory text based around Patanjali Yoga Sutras, and I don't think there's any comparable commentary on it. The Patanjali Yoga Sutras are by their nature simply terse and terse statements, not even in sentences often, sometimes in single words, 2 or 3 words. And the whole idea of it is to make a learning from it. It's the best way of learning. Supposing we study time management. Today I was talking to somebody about time management. Supposing during our discourse, I mention a catchphrase. I say, time is money. In fact, there's a course like that. T-I-M-E, time is money, exactly. Because how we treat time has a value. Every second has a value. Now, supposing I mention time is money, and you remember this phrase, but that's all I give you. Having previously sat down and discussed all the implications why we say that time is equivalent to money, 1 hour lecture, 2 hours lecture, you take copious notes. It's not necessary to remember everything we discussed. Simply by saying time is money, you'll remember everything we discussed. It acts like a trigger. That's the way aphorisms work. These sutras bear threads, minimum threads, enough to take that thread and make a nice expansion with it. And that triggers off memory after memory and link after link until you remember, oh, this is exactly what we discussed. It's a wonderful learning technique. And so it's necessary, if you have the sutra literature, regardless of what it is, whether it's Brahma Sutras, Narada Bhakti Sutras, or this Raja Yoga Sutra, every avenue, every approach, which we call yoga, every one of these 4 yogas will have a sutra literature attached to it, so that we can learn just by picking up the thread. So Swami Vivekananda makes this wonderful response to a question. The question in his day was, why does this man, Vivekananda, they thought he was French, Vivekananda, linger in our land? Why doesn't he show us the Indian rope trick and go home? He's an American. So he writes this book as a response here with Indian rope trick. And the way he is presenting it is as a science of religion. It's a Raja Yoga, royal yoga, because it is the path of the mind. It is the psyche that is in the way, or that is the Revila, either one. So he writes a beautiful introductory. And we'll put this in this connection of this free will. So he starts off by saying, all our knowledge is based upon experience. What kind of experience? Is this limited experience? Is this experience in a causal relationship? Yes. because the knowledge we have is caused by our experience. There's a causal link straight away. What we call inferential knowledge, he says, in which we go from the less to the more general, or from the general to the particular, has experience as its basis. He says, in what are called the exact sciences, people easily find the truth because it appeals to the particular experiences of every human being. Now he brings in the appeal to the scientific mind and scientific world. He says, the scientist does not tell you to believe in anything, but he has certain results which come from his own experiences. And reasoning on them, when he asks us to believe in his conclusions, he appeals to some universal experience of humanity. This is a science because in an age where very often, particularly in the Western world, science is put as an opposite to religion. You can't believe in God and believe in science. The two cannot coexist, is the misunderstanding. But this misunderstanding comes from a particular mindset that says that man is the highest pinnacle of any straight line process. Any linear process has arrived at man. We can call this evolution, and man is the highest thing. But there are great faults with this argument. And so he is bringing these faults up. So he starts off like that, and then he goes then on to the introduction itself for the Vedanta Yoga Sutras. That introductory is an introductory to the entire subject. So he starts off his introduction to the Yoga Sutras by saying, before going into these aphorisms, these sutras, he wants to try to discuss a great question, and upon which rests the whole theory of religion for yogis. Don't forget, science on one side, religion on the other, a false dichotomy. He says, it seems the consensus of opinion of the great minds of the world. He's talking of scientists, he's talking of philosophers. And it has been nearly demonstrated by researchers into physical nature that we are the outcome and manifestation of an absolute condition. And of course, an absolute condition can have no free will, in my addition, in the context of your question. So we all acknowledge that there must be an absolute condition somewhere. The great minds will have to think of that. Modern science puts this absolute in a very, very peculiar way. It says there is an unknown entity. And we can pick up language from studying a phenomenon at the very center of every galaxy called black hole. And as soon as you move past a certain horizon where time and space and causality and free will and all these things exist, it goes into an apparent annihilation. Is it possible, was the question brought up by a man called Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking, two people, one of which is still alive. Most famous you'll recognize, of course, as Stephen Hawking. Thinks that, you see, if the universe is infinitely expanding, then you can play the movie back and get to an origin somewhere, an absolute somewhere. But we can't define what it is. But we have coined a term called singularity in connection with black holes. And so if the whole thing goes back to there, it can arrive at a singularity where there is no time and no space. Don't forget, free will requires space and requires time, because determinism in a causal relationship means that whatever is the effect is a future thing. And whatever a cause is a preceding thing. Time has to be involved. And then if something has to occur within that period of time, space also has to be involved. So space, time, and causation are really the whole framework for this whole universe. Space and time, put as in phrases in Sanskrit, along with name and form, is the entire warp and woof, if you will, of this universe, the entire fabric. So, whatever this absolute is, we have to acknowledge that everything came out as a manifestation from this. And this is at the back of our present relative condition, he says, and are going forward to return to that absolute. That's a logical way of understanding it. If we are returning to this absolute, then where is this linear progression? If there's an absolute at the beginning, will there be an absolute at the end? And are we justified in making a linear progression? And then, which is better, is a question asked. The absolute or this state that we're in now? And he says there are not wanting people, he's aiming at materialists, who think that this manifested state is the highest state of man. Man with his ingenuity, man with his incredible developments, man who through his brain power has enabled himself to fly without wings by designing aircraft, man who has caught into the practical implementation of the quantum mechanics that he does not understand, and yet he has applied it. It's not difficult to consider, particularly at my age, going back and seeing all the various events of the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20, 30, the last 50 years. When I was growing up, and even probably, up to my maybe 40s, even 50s, actually, a mobile phone was not even heard of. I remember the first mobile phones coming up. They were like massive bricks, that you had to carry around with you. And a computer was something that took a huge building, something like a block worth of building in a city with several floors, and a computer system with revolving tapes, and the capacity that is only probably in your mobile phone today. So such rapid advances make some people think that man is now at his pinnacle. The whole evolution of man is now at its very height. And then the next thing would be having gone where no man has gone before. In other words, having gone where no civilization has gone before, having attained the intellectual pinnacle of his life, we now can design and manufacture machines that will provide artificial intelligence and make man irrelevant. This is a fear of some seeming thinking people. Thinkers of great caliber, he says, are of the opinion that we are manifestations of undifferentiated being, and the differentiated state is higher than the absolute. They imagine that in the absolute there cannot be any quality. Differentiated state in two senses, one in the materialist sense and the other in a religious sense. The absolute, if you consider something that is absolute, cannot be any quality. It must be insensate, dull, and lifeless. That only this life can be enjoyed, and therefore we must cling to it. That is, if you ask modern materialist atheists what they feel this life is about, they'll reply in a negative: it has no purpose, only the purpose that you create now. There's no afterlife. So when this body is done with, you go into a state of annihilation. That's all there is. There's nothing more to it. And all we want to inquire into other solutions of life. There was an old solution, he says, that man after death remained the same. That's one position. that all his good sides minus his evil sides remain forever. Logically stated, this means that man's goal is the world. This world carried a stage higher. Of course, he's referring to religions that believe in a post-mortem condition, higher condition, which is really just an extension of a pleasure garden that we can find here. You take the good and you minus the evil, and that's a post-mortem condition, and we want to aim for that. And it is those people who will say that this world is not determined, is an indeterminate world where free will can steer you in a certain direction and get you, by virtue of this, to this particular post-mortem condition. This theory, he says, on the face of it is absurd and puerile, because it cannot be there. There cannot be good without evil, nor evil without good. To live in a world where it is all good and no evil is what Sanskrit logicians call a dream in the air. What is your aim? I want to get to heaven. Unfortunately, it's a dream in the air. Another theory in modern times, he says, has been presented in several schools, that man's destiny is to go on always improving, always struggling towards, but never reaching the goal. That is the Buddhist view. You're going on and on and on. You never reach the goal. A continuous incarnation, reincarnation, and so it goes. There's no absolute in it. This statement, though apparently very nice, is also absurd, because there's no such thing as motion in a straight line. There it is. Now here Swami Vivekananda is preempting many of the conclusions of modern science today, even in his time. Every motion, he says, is in a circle. If you can take up a stone and project it into space and then live long enough, that stone, if it meets with no obstruction, will come back exactly to your hand. And this Einstein calls general relativity and the curvature of space-time. And Vivekananda had it way before Einstein. Einstein only put it in the early 20th century. A straight line, he says, infinitely projected, must end in a circle. Therefore, this idea that the destiny of man is progressing ever forward and never stopping, and that's absurd. Although extraneous to the subject, he says, I may remark that this idea explains the ethical theory that you must not hate and must not love. You hate, it'll come round in a circle and impact on you. If you love, same thing, it comes back to you. Everything comes back to you. And this is the run motive for a good moral and ethical behavior. And he says just because just in the case of electricity, the modern theory is that the power leaves the dynamo and completes the circle back to the dynamo. So with hate and love, when you generate electricity from a dynamo, you make a circuit, closed circuit. Or your electrical power is based on completion of a circuit. Or at least now with alternating current, that also is possible. Therefore, do not hate anybody, because that hatred which comes out from you must in the long run come back to you. And if you love, that love will come back to you, completing the circle. Now, can you imagine what impact does this have on evolution, biological evolution? Many materialist biologists today, denying a teleology, a purpose in life, will say we begin at this point. We don't know how it began, but there's a beginning here, a biogenesis here. And then it goes on and in a straight line, and each part of the line is a kind of progression. We can make it like a tree, actually, something like that. That may come to a conclusion that man is the end of it, finished, nothing more. So, supposing you change your view and you say, no, evolution is a circle. Swami Vivekananda describes this cyclical arrangement as if you take a circle and you put infinite points on it, A, B, A, B, A, B, you don't know which came first, the A or the B. The chicken and the egg, or the egg, is an impossible question to ask and answer. What is the starting point? Is B followed by A, or A preceding B? It's all equal on a circle. And that then means that the causality that we're discussing is of a different kind. The causality of the actual circle and the law of that cyclical arrangement, that is determined, deterministic. But we are a free area. And so this idea that freedom and will cannot be compatible terms is because freedom is free, it's unlimited. Coming back to our example of the animal tethered to a post. Freedom means there's no tethering taking place. Absolutely free means there's no causality within it, no functionality within it, no limitation within it. Free is free, unconditional, not conditioned by law, not conditioned by constraint or restraint. That's my phone going. We'll have to leave it going. Some people think it's Sherwood Forest calling. Right. So then he says, on the other and practical grounds, we see that the theory of eternal progression is untenable, for destruction is the goal of everything earthly. He supports his argument. All our struggles and hopes and fears and joys, what will they lead to? We shall all end in death. Nothing is so certain as this, he says. Where then is this motion in a straight line, this infinite progression? It is only going out to a distance and coming back to the center from which it started. See how from nebulae the sun, moon, and stars are produced. Then they dissolve and go back to nebulae. The same is being done everywhere. See how beautifully he puts it. Then he shifts his example. The plant takes material from the earth, dissolves and gives it back. Every form in this world is taken out of surrounding atoms and goes back to these atoms. That's how it is. Like breathing, you breathe out, you breathe in, breathe out, breathe in. It cannot be that the same law acts differently in different places. The law of nature is absolutely constant. You cannot find any exception. This is an axiom of his, an a priori standpoint that tells us, firstly, if you have a law operating here, you will have it everywhere. What happens on the microcosm happens on the macrocosm. What happens at the tiniest, most subtle, fundamental corner of the universe is actually the rule everywhere. I think I mentioned at some other talk, the great scientist Leonard Susskind, who's an agnostic at best. He says, what we see around here as this world is but an approximation of what is. He understands it, but then he doesn't say what is. So, from whom all this universe comes out, he makes a quotation, in whom all that is born and lives, and to whom all returns. He's making this Upanishadic quotation. This is one fact that is certain. Nature works on the same plan. What is being worked out in one sphere is repeated in millions of spheres. What you see with planets, the same will it be with the earth, with men, and with all things. The huge wave is a mighty compound of small waves. It may be of millions. The life of the whole world is a compound of millions of little lives. And the death of the whole world is the compound of the deaths of these millions of little beings. What he's done now is he's taken you from a microcosmic, small unit point of view and taken you expansively out and upward and beyond. It's a meditation. Now he comes back and asks this practical question. Now the question arises, he says, is going back to God the highest state or not? The philosophers of the yoga school emphatically answer that it is. And they say that man's present state is a degeneration. There's not one religion on the face of the earth which says that man is an improvement. Brings it to a universal conclusion. The idea is that his beginning is perfect and pure. Of course, various religions may emphasize some theological shift from that, but fundamentally, that's what they would believe, that the kingdom of heaven is within you and that it is your birthright. And so the idea that his beginning is perfect and pure, that he degenerates until he cannot degenerate further. Man is a degeneration. And that there must come a time when he shoots upward again to complete the circle. And he argues also that if man is the highest state, how is it that we find degenerated behavior in man? He doesn't exactly put it like that, but that's his purport of his argument. And so he puts it like that. This is the method of putting it in the dualistic form. What is the method? Is that however low he may go, man may go, he must ultimately take the upward bend and go back to the original source, which is God. When I deal with children, I ask them to recite this. Life is a journey. We are the traveler. We come from God and we go to God. Man comes from God in the beginning. In the middle, he becomes man. And in the end, he goes back to God. This is the method of putting it, of course, in the dualistic form. But the Advaita form, the non-dualistic form, is that man is God and goes back to him again. If our present state is the higher one, then he says, then why is there so much horror and misery? And why is there an end to it? If this is the highest state, why does it end? That which corrupts and degenerates cannot be the highest state. Why should it be so diabolical, so unsatisfying? It is only excusable in as much as although as we are taking a higher groove, we have to pass through it in order to become regenerate again. Put a seed into the ground and it disintegrates. It loses its characteristics and transforms into something else. It dissolves. And every soul must disintegrate to become God. What is evolution? Therefore, it's devolution. It's going back to our origin, not degenerating in a moral sense, but there is a degeneration. That is, there is a slowing off of the skin of humanity so that God is there standing full and free and exposed. There are much higher states of existence, he goes on later to say, beyond reasoning. It is really beyond the intellect that the first state of religious life to be found. There are so many different angles and opinions. I belong to Dublin City Interfaith Forum. I represent Hinduism on this forum. We had a few days ago a wonderful opportunity offered by the mayor of Dublin that in the midst of COVID and the COVID crisis, different religious traditions didn't get the opportunity to publicly celebrate their religious festivals, such as Hanukkah for the Jewish people. We're still in that, or Diwali for the Hindus. And so every day has been given as an opportunity for different religious traditions to give some token public expression of their suppressed festivals. But you see, if you leave it there as a cultural expression, if you leave it there as an intellectual maneuvering of dogma and doctrine, that this is right and that is wrong, if you think that interfaith agreement and ecumenism is a question of bargaining, I knock out this doctrine and you knock out this one. I'll accept this and you reject that. This is not what religion is. Religion is beyond the state of the intellect and of reasoning. And he says, when you step beyond thought and intellect and all reasoning, then you have made the first step toward God. And that is the beginning of life. What is commonly called life is but an embryo state. Then he goes on, how can we prove this? The next question would be, what proof is there that the state beyond thought and reasoning is in fact the highest state? And then he mentions all the evidence provided by those who have seen, the great world movers, the great saints, the great mystics, who you cannot put down to mere hallucination or aberration or mistake, and endorsed one by one, regardless of religion and faith, regardless of tradition, endorsing the same truth, the same reality, time and time again. These rare individuals are there. And secondly, the method is also made clear. Not only is the end discovery told, but the scientific process of getting there. What is the scientific method? Accept credible testimony. At the moment, there are many positions in terms of cosmologies and other aspects of science that are declared by those who have researched it. Nobody has ever seen the COVID virus, or at least nobody who is not in the scientific world. But we are assured by scientists that it is true. So we take the credible testimony that we ourselves cannot see unless we are specialists in the area. And then the next thing is we can do the experimentation ourselves. We are told, okay, so unwittingly an experimentation is there, that if you mix with people on a certain proportion, the likelihood of getting the virus increases. And then statistics can be produced. And then, of course, it goes on. So the whole formula, the whole pattern of scientific discovery is to credible testimony, and then a model that you can test. This is called the structure of yoga. And from that structure is then to, having made the experiment, get the direct verification for yourself. And it has to conform to something that is systematic and logic, something that is scientifically presented. The final conclusion that you have is your proof. The rest is evidence, ranging from verbal testimony to logical reasoning and so on and so forth. But the final proof is your direct perception. And it is exactly the same here, and that is why it's called a science of religion. So he concludes this beginning by saying, the sensible world will be the limit to our knowledge if we cannot go farther, if we must not ask for anything more. This is what is called agnosticism. But what reason is there to believe in the testimony of the senses? He now challenges what we normally consider to be not worth verifying, because every day we wake up, every day the sun shines, every day we can see, we can hear, we can touch, we can taste. And for us, this world is real. But it's a very flimsy kind of testimony. I would call that man a true agnostic who would stand still in the street and die. If reason is all in all, it leaves us no place to stand on this side of nihilism. If a man is agnostic of everything but money, fame, and name, he is only a fraud. Immanuel Kant has proved beyond all doubt that we cannot penetrate beyond the tremendous dead wall of called reason. But that is the very first idea upon which all Indian thought takes its stand and dares to seek and succeeds in finding something higher than reason, where alone the explanation of the present state is to be found. This is the value of the study of something that will take us beyond the world, namely, in the context, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Thou art our Father, and will take us to the other shore of this ocean of ignorance. This is the science of religion and nothing else. Let us return to the original question and where all this fits. The whole process from here on, which we call yoga, is then deterministic. That is, we are exercising a free choice. And then from that, we are getting a resolve, and that we are making a cultivation of the psyche, the mind, through concentration and preliminary practices of moral training, including calming down and dealing with the nervous system through a system of controlling universal energy that we call pranayama. So it requires the assumption of free choice to begin with. But freedom and choice, freedom and will are forever dissociated, since what we are seeking is, in the description of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the 4th section, Kaivalya, that is true freedom. And so we are using the limited will to access freedom that has no will at all, and yet is everything, not nothing. So these arguments about free will have been going on for centuries and centuries, thousands of years. And there is a very interesting and useful study, scientific study, called the Conway strong free will theorem. And what it is saying is that at the very subtlest part of our scientific investigation, because the determination of an experiment is entirely up to us without any preconditions, we can determine the outcome of the experiment by deciding what experiment to make. And there's a huge Kochen-Conway strong will, free will theorem is there. At that level, of course, there's free will. On the universal level, that is the Newtonian waking world of Newtonian physics and so on, then there is a determinism there. And I began this by saying, you can't say definitively, you can only say, oh, from what standpoint are you looking at? For our purpose, we exercise our capacity to use the intellect, the determining factor, in order to steer our life in a correct direction and lead us to a conclusion that there is no free will. Coming full circle. All right, so 12 o'clock now, so we can finish off. I normally give provision for one last small question, if that's available, and then we conclude today's session. All right. You see, there's an argument that says, I just carry on just to conclude. It's like an underlying stroke of a symphony. That the argument is that everything, if in a causal relationship, everything is like a series of dominoes, that it has to fall into place in a certain way. But the danger of understanding that or taking that position will be fatalism. Fatalism means we have no role in determining anything in this second and the next second, and clearly we do. So we have no control over past activities, but future activities or future outcomes, this blank check that comes now called a second, is something that we can fill in as we want, as we have determined to do so, because there's a free area behind us that enables us to have this reflected sense of freedom in the intellect. Intellect is a kind of tool that we have with borrowed light from this free area. And with this, we can make our determinism and our executive decisions. That is why that faculty is with us. And the illusion is that it is freely chosen by us. The illusion comes because we have a free area. If we didn't have that free area called Atman, then we would not be able to have its reflected version in the intellect. So there are many dimensions to this question, and I've given you the shortened version. All right, we finish off then. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thank you.